Vowell writes about the long and sordid history of Canada and Indigenous peoples. And in the Indigenous rights text, she talks about the stealing of lives being perpetuated by the people that advocate for adoption of First Nation children today. Our video will show that not only have Indigenous people experienced historical trauma, but also that it continues in systematic ways today. In Canada, stereotypes around Indigenous people include them being lazy and drunken burdens on society, which is yet another facet of the systematic oppression being placed on these people and used to remove and separate their families and take their children from their homes.
Living conditions you'd only expect to see in a third world country.
Living conditions can only be described as third world.
Mold-infested homes, shacks, and uninsulated tents where buckets serve as bathrooms.
Lack of sewer and running water.
Vowell writes about residential schools, 150 years of operation, 150,000 children attended until 1996. At least 6,000 children died. The legacy of physical and sexual abuse by Christians operating these schools cannot be understated. History always seems far away, as if these things happened a long time ago. But residential schools only closed in 1996, 27 years ago.
I wish if there was no residential schools. If there was no residential schools, my mom would have taught me her traditional ways. If there was no residential schools, my mom would have taught me her carrier language. If there was no residential schools, I wouldn't have been ashamed of being Indigenous.
Though we hear more about the 60s scoop where children were taken from homes in the 60s, the text talks about the millennial scoop in these words. Recently, Cora Morgan, Manitoba's First Nation family advocate, raised the alarm on the seizure of Indigenous infants, stating that social workers were removing an average of one newborn a day in the province. And in 2015, the CBC reported that Cora Morgan told the Canadian press that she was with a mother in the hospital on Monday when Child and Family Services took the woman's 3-day-old son. The only reason given was that the mother had been a ward of family services until she was 18. Additionally, the government was notorious for relocating Indigenous communities to less prolific settlements, and also the government oversaw the killings of many Inuit dogs, which facilitated their hunting, gathering, and harvesting as part of their relocation program. The effects of trauma are varied and long-lasting, and in the case of Indigenous peoples in Canada, it's ongoing. The collective trauma passed down generation has shown to cause physical, emotional, and spiritual destruction. Even though the descendants may not have experienced the abuse directly, the effects burnt on the psyche of the sufferer can be transferred genetically, where parents transmit survival messages to their children by DNA. With the cultural identities of generations of people systematically stripped away, survivors face poverty, confusion, displacement, and post-traumatic stress disorder that leads them to coping mechanisms like substance and alcohol abuse. Colonization is a disempowering beast that can render generations hopeless. Humans are not meant to live in a survival mode and maintain high stress levels. But just watching the news will show the terror that still resides in the cities where Native people live. The death by suicide rate is really high, as well as the missing number of women. A look at the Highway of Tears is a heartbreaking 724-kilometer highway in British Columbia where women, mostly Indigenous, have disappeared or been killed. Hurt people, and the cycle of abuse continues. Studies show that combining Western and Indigenous modalities will improve people's mental and physical health. A great Indigenous healing practice is the 7 grandfather teachings, which are moral, spiritual, and social practices that are passed down to the ancestors to encourage living a good life in peace and without conflict. They include humility, we're lower than the things that sustain us. Bravery, have a strong, courageous heart. Honesty, living virtuously. Wisdom, living with clear vision. Truth, speaking only what you've lived or experienced. Respect, being kind to all creation. And love, living with unconditional love. By combining the two practices, healers can offer more appropriate resources, effective counsel, and a safe space for the growing Indigenous population to heal. Later, I discuss successful initiatives blending both healing practices. But for now, let's talk about the main barrier to healing: oppression. Peggy McIntosh, in her essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, unfolds the oblivion of privilege and the silent agenda. She writes, "The silence and denials surrounding privilege are the key political tool here." Listening to the people who have gone through the abuse, implementing appropriate training and policies, and also just allowing people to speak their truth will start the reconciliation. As promised earlier, here are some successful initiatives that are teaching Indigenous youths through trauma-informed practices that they are resilient, strong, beautiful, and significant, which is something they need to hear. Thank you.